class with large gains, and 90% of people there are from Asia. And then you have absence of growth among poorer people in rich countries, which of course opens up a host of political issues, which I will not discuss today. And then you have finally the top 1%, which have done very well during globalization. So essentially, I think it summarizes what happened during the 25 years of globalization. Now, that same graph can be, oh, this is the wrong, okay, I got the wrong one in a rush. Anyway, so I wanted to show you the graph which shows that the same gains with in absolute terms. And the striking thing there is that almost half of the gains in absolute terms went to the top 5%. And it's not surprising because the gaps in incomes in the world are enormous. We are talking about the ratio, at the median you have people of about $5 per day, and at the top you have, not even 1 top percent, but you have people about $200 per day. So obviously if somebody at the $200 has a very small increase in income, let's suppose of 1%, he would get or she would get $2. Now for a person who has $5 per day, $2 would present 40% of an increase in income. So because of these gaps, absolute gains are very heavily concentrated still among the top. And my last slide is actually something which I actually done only recently. That's the first time that I show it. It's the same slide like the previous one, but this now covers only the last 3 years that I have between 2008 and 2011. Now the interesting part in this slide, and it could slightly change still, is that here we don't see the evidence of the significantly rising income of the top 1% globally. And at first, and it still is, it's a little bit of a puzzle. The rest of the shape is exactly the same as it was from 1988 to 2008. But here, I think we do actually see the effects of the crisis in the rich world. In other words, one should not forget that one top percent at the world level is something like 70 million people, or in my sample, something like 60 million. So it's like almost the entire Germany, of the whole France. So you actually, in order to have a large increase in incomes of such a large group of people who are already very rich, you do have to have very strong growth in rich countries. And I think actually that what we have seen from Olivier's data and also from Saez's data and so on, I think that that increase was very limited to the very top, could have been 1/10 or even 1/100th of a percent in the rich countries. So when you put it at a global level, it just does not really have the sufficient size to show the large gains of the top 1%. So I'm leaving it as in a very sort of, how should I say, preliminary stage. These data are not yet, I might have a few other countries, but I don't think it's going to change very dramatically because all the large countries are there. So in other words, the bottom line would be that in the period of the crisis, at least up to 2011, we see the continuation of the same shape that we have seen before, with large gains in the middle class, global middle class, relatively poor people, but really absence of significant gains at the global top 1%, which is somewhat of a difference from what we have seen between 1988 and 2008. So that would be all for today, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our third speaker is Steve Rose of George Washington University. Thank you, Jamie, for inviting me tonight, and thank all the panelists. And what I'm going to talk today is, I'm a data guy, but I'm not going to talk data. I'm really going to give you a few data points, and I'm really going to try to focus on the main contradiction that we face, that everyone has talked about inequality, and one would think that the rising inequality and all the story around it would have led to a political revolt against rising inequality. So I'm going to try and talk about why we have so much discussion of inequality and why the political revolt has been so little. And in fact, what I'm going to say is that the Piketty and Sates data overestimate inequality substantially, and I'm going to do that by relying on data from the Congressional Budget Office. Another thing that's going to be very important is the difference between absolute and relative gains. That is, you can have very unequal relative gains, but absolutely it will turn out to be very differently. And you'll see that quite soon when I present the few data points that I'm going to present. To be clear, any way you approach it, is inequality is up and inequality is up a lot. It's outrageous how the top 1% or the 1/10 of 1% live. And it is Piketty and Sates' credit to focus attention on inequality, and in particular to provide data on the top 1% that we've really never had before. And obviously in the Great Recession, that seemingly has magnified its importance. What matters, though, is how we change the state of affairs. And how we change the state of affairs really will depend on what we think is happening among the middle classes. And just to give you one sense of what might be two different political policy agendas, most of what comes from Piketty and Sates, if we were going to say that to change it, we need to increase government revenues to do something to change it, because most of the plans that we do to change it will involve public action. So Piketty and Sates' data, percent, but not the bottom 90%. In a book that I wrote in 2010, I said we need change, and that income tax rates should increase for households with 75 proposals. Neither one are likely to pass, but at least you have some consent. In the 1960s, it's called managed capitalism, and it looks to be very important, and like maybe we should go back to it because we had unionization there. On the political front, what we see is that inequality doesn't seem to have had resonance, and that in the early 1979s, I produced this thing on social stratification in the US, trying to show it, how the differences between the poor, the middle, the somewhat rich, and the very rich. And we did political change. That was the logic of what we did. And yet with isolated examples have been very little. And obviously in December 2014, what we saw was disastrous. That the party that stood against, caring about inequality, the party that stood for lower taxes on the rich and less regulations, won across the board. And what you saw the following is, so 5 states that were Republican states had referendum on raising the minimum wage, and they all passed substantially. And you found that 1/3 of the people who thought that the condition of the poor were so bad that we had to raise the minimum wage voted for the Republican over the Democrat. So faced with this political contradiction, on the one hand, there's one answer that's popular among the left and it's been used very regularly. The people are just wrong. If they knew their true interests, they would vote for Democrats that clearly have their true interests more in mind than Republicans. They may not be perfect, but it's clearly more. So if they don't do this, why are they doing this? And in the modern terms, what we really rely a lot on is money in politics. Of course, previous studies on money in politics haven't shown that strong an effect. And maybe it's changed recently with, Citizens United. But in fact, a lot of Democrats spent more than had more money to spend than Republicans and still lost. Or one could talk about what I'm going to try to show is that the middle class has not had such a bad deal. They don't have their fair share, as I will show, but they've had a fairly good share. And that this has made them identify more with the economy as a whole, and they have very contradictory ideas. I first said this idea is about 7 years ago when I criticized what's the matter with Kansas. And basically I said it's really just an occupational hazard of people with big hearts to see problems. And they then have a little echo chamber and say to each other over and over this. And also the media has a role in this, and that is bad news is just more interesting than good news. There was a study that was done that showed in bad economic times, the ratio of bad economic news on the front page to good news was 10-to-1. In good economic times, the ratio of bad economic news to good economic news was 7-to-1. That is, that's what gets reported. Let me now talk to the data. I have a paper on a thing called itif.org with some of the data, and there's obviously a lot of discussions on methodology and choices, but I'm just going to give some highlights of the data. So I'm going to cite 3 data sources and 3 numbers from the different data sources. On the one hand, you have Piketty and Sates. On the other hand, you have something that we use a lot, current population survey. And on the third hand, the data I'm going to use a lot is the Congressional Budget Office. The CBO has all of these sources, it turns out, will be very different. So if we look at the average income in the bottom 20%, in Piketty and Sates, it's $2,000 is the average income per filer. In CPS, it's $12,000, and in CBO, it's $24,000. If we look at the median incomes, Piketty and Sates, it's $30,000, CPS is $53,000, CBO, it's $77,000. So given these wide disparities, even at the median, it shouldn't be surprised we get different results. Why do Piketty and Sates only have 2,000 at the bottom? They make two methodological choices that end up with a lot of very low income people. One is they use IRS records, and there's 37 million more filers than there are households, and these are mainly kids, almost uniformly kids who are filing separately from their family, but they're now counted as a full household in Piketty and Sates. And the second choice that they make is to exclude transfer payments, which basically means that the 20% of the elderly have either zero or much lower incomes than they do. In terms of growth, in Piketty and Sates, if you look at 1979 to 2007, what they show is 91% of income growth per household went to the top 10%, and 9% went to the bottom 90%, 9 to the bottom 90. What that translated in for the bottom 90%, because I'm going to focus on the bottom 90% because I care about politics. In the bottom 90%, that translates into a 5% gain from 1979 to 2007, because that's before the recession. After the recession, the numbers in Piketty and Sates are minus 10%, 2010 compared to 1979. In other words, the bottom 90% are supposedly absolutely 10% worse. CBO gives you something very different. Instead of 9% going to the bottom 90%, it's 59%. And instead of 5% growth, it's 50% in after tax 9. It's just a remarkably different thing. And obviously there's still inequality there, because what it means is the top 10 got 41% of the growth. So inequality is there, but it's on a much different level. And if you want to think politically, what might be versus a 50% growth, you get something very differently. So the negativists, when they see numbers that I present like this, people, compared to your parents, how do you live, better or worse off? The numbers Pew asked in 2012, we have bad times, but do you think that American growth will persist? 63% say yes. Among young people, it's 70%. If you ask young people in a different survey whether they're going to live as well as their parents or better, 80% say yes. So there are many things that I can say, and I go into great detail to try and show what's consistent with growth, and I go commodity by commodity to show how it changes. I'll talk about one simple thing. It's called the Starbucks test. We spend spending $3 to $4 a cup of coffee twice a day. This is not a sign of people who have no discretionary income. The second thing I'll cite is that how people really experience their lives is over a life cycle. And they start low and they go up. And by the time that they get this, I want you to think for a moment, 46 to 59 at the end of their careers when they're earning the most, median household income of those that are married, and that's 74% of people, is $90,000. The 25th percentile is $55,000, and the 75th percentile is $140,000. What that means is that the majority of the people spend many years in reasonably having options of the middle class things. In the end, to conclude, despite the weak economy, the Piketty book and the Occupy movement, that's somewhat similar, did not have the political effects that many expected, because inequality per se is a secondary or even tertiary issue. Americans, on the basis of fairness, will vote for something like increasing the minimum wage. In principle, they even say they're for health care for all. What they don't like is a government program. Furthermore, they say the rich should be taxed more. But when asked about the inheritance tax, they say, no, that should be done away with by a large number. That's like 67% say we should do away with the inheritance tax. And when you say, should we increase or decrease the corporate income tax, they're way for doing it. So the bottom line is, if you try and think about inequality, it is up. Many of the people in this room want it to be not up. But if you think that it's only up at 5%, then, well, if you don't think that it's up in 5%, then you'll understand that Picayune states have a limited approach. And whether it's 50% or I had written a thing of 30%, it really changes what our options are, and I think that's an important thing to think about. Thank you.
And our fourth speaker, Joe Stiglitz of Columbia University.
Well, I'm not going to answer the question about which of these numbers is right. I am going to begin with the premise that about which there is overwhelming evidence that there has been a significant increase in inequality. And what I want to do is to talk about what are some of the implications, some